last video in this game design tutor series, I talked about core mechanics, and you can find that there. And at the end of that video, I said I was going to talk next about something I called the peripheral core. Now, it's taken a while since I made that video to make this one, if you're following along live. Reason being, I knew what I meant when I said peripheral core, but actually turning it into words has proved quite difficult. So I'm going to start by talking about what I mean when I say the peripheral core. So bear with me. When you're thinking about some aspect of a game that you're designing, or a game that you're playing, or a game you're thinking about, ask yourself this: if you change that aspect of the game in any way, does it affect the core mechanics? And ask yourself this: if you take it out completely, will the game fall apart? So if the answer to the first one is no, it won't change the core mechanics at all, but the answer to the second one is yes, the game won't work without this, then you've got an aspect of your peripheral core. Now, I suspect you're going to want some examples, and this is where it gets tricky. You see, whether something affects the core mechanics depends hugely upon what you have decided the core mechanics are going to be. In the second video in this series, and the one where we really started talking about the principles of game design, I talked about foundational goals. And you can see that there. Now, your foundational goals, which you can find about in that video, can vary enormously. And what you put into your foundational goals are going to dictate what your core mechanics are. And sometimes some things are going to form a part of your core mechanics, not because they need to be at the core, but because you, in your foundational goals, decided that some part of your core mechanics needed to include this thing, because it's something you felt strongly about. It's something you wanted to have in the game. It was perhaps something that you hadn't seen in other games and you wanted to try it, or it's something that you thought was underappreciated by designers and you wanted to make it something at the heart of your game. Give you an example from miniatures war games. There is technically a game out there called Mercs. I say technically because not a lot has been happening with it recently, but there was a Kickstarter not that long ago for a second edition. And at the heart of the original Mercs mechanics was the idea that you would use these special cards in the game. And one of the jobs that these cards performed was movement. So they actually had a little cutout at the bottom of the card that you could lay against the base of whatever miniature was moving so that you could move that miniature. Now, whether that movement mechanic was or was not in the core or in the peripheral core would very much depend upon the designer. If they were absolutely fixed upon the idea that this was going to be how we did movement, that was part of the foundational goals, then it's absolutely a core mechanic. If you take it away, it's no longer Mercs. On the other hand, if that just sort of evolved later and it was the dice mechanics that were core, then it could be part of the peripheral core. Now, if you're here thinking about game design in general terms, not just about miniature war games, which is sort of my meat and drink, then it's worth saying that in board games, generally speaking, the peripheral core is really small. The fact is, in a board game, once you've established your core mechanic, you can do anything. You know, you can add stuff, take it away, make it larger, make it smaller, add more components, take components. It doesn't matter. Okay? The core mechanic is fixed, and whatever you do next is just implementing the core mechanic on the tabletop. In a card game, though, you start to see the peripheral core appear, particularly in your collectible card games and your living card games. So things like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, but also things like Netrunner. I'm not big on living card games, so don't ask me to name any more. But in a card game like this, if you assume in a card game that there are two types, there's a card game where you take the cards out of the game and you get started playing. In those cases, the cards effectively form part of the board game. Okay? You don't spend time studying them, memorizing them, articulating them. They've got to be simple, they've got to be straightforward. But when you get to a living card game or a collectible card game, the assumption is that players are going to spend time between games studying the cards, learning them, looking for the synchronicities and the synergies that fall between cards. And for that reason, card game designers think very long and hard about card layout. What you can include on the card, what you can't. And that's where you start to see the peripheral core taking shape. The most obvious manifestation of the peripheral core in a card game like this, a collectible card game, living card game, is the size of the card. The bigger the card, the more information you can include. The bigger the card, the more emphasis you can give to certain aspects of that information. But as the card gets smaller, so it becomes harder for the player to see a plethora of information on that card. So the size of the card is a really good example of the peripheral core. You know, if you make a card too small, the game won't work. The core mechanic isn't affected, but the game won't work without the information you need on the card. Okay? As you grow the card, you can put more on it, but the game becomes unwieldy. Will the game work if every card is the size of an A4 sheet of paper? No, it probably won't. So that's where you start to see the peripheral core come into play, and of course it then feeds on in card games into the information you put on the card. Some information must be on the card because it's part of the core. It's part of the core mechanics, how the game works. Take an example in... Okay, I could name anything from Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, whatever. Generally speaking, cards have got an attack stat and a defense stat. That's how it works. And that would be considered core to the game. You might consider in Pokemon, for example, to be the type of Pokemon to be core to the game. Is it electrical type, water type? Because those things affect stuff. It's arguable, but at its core, that's the core mechanic. That's why it's called that. You know, you've got an attack and a defense. Is my attack higher than your defense? Yes, I win. End of story. That's the core mechanic. Everything else you add on to it, not core. Is it peripheral? Probably not. And we're going to talk about the rest of the game later. You know, the stuff that gives it flavour, that gives it a feel for the setting that you're actually setting it. Now, if we look at role-play games, we start to see the peripheral core grow larger. Because in a role-play game, you're immediately starting to think about things like, well, my ability as a character to move within the game. Are we talking about a tactical miniatures-driven style combat, or is it all theatre of the mind? But regardless, I need to know, how far can I run? How far can my weapons reach? You know, these things become important to the game. Without that knowledge, the game starts to fall apart. Now, it doesn't mean that you've got to put an absolute figure on, yes, you can run 30 feet in this time, or yes, this polearm can actually strike 7 feet away. You don't have to be that specific, but as a designer, you do have to think, how am I going to build this into the game? How is it going to be around the core mechanics as a peripheral without the game falling apart? And in RPGs, you also, naturally, it's a game geared towards interacting with the world in which you are participating. So you need to have rules that govern how you interact with other people, with the environment, with scenery, with computers, with magical spirits, whatever it might be. You need to have rules that govern how the players interact with the world in which they are adventuring. So all of that would constitute the peripheral core, because without that, the game falls apart. But it doesn't need to affect the core mechanics. Now, of course, you can bring the core mechanics into it, and you can say, well, I'm going to use the core mechanics to drive that interaction. Of course you can. Horizon War Zero Dark, one of my games, really good example, where the core mechanic, which I talked about in the core mechanics episode, rolling 12-sided dice and forming groups of dice that meet or exceed a certain target number. You know, I took those mechanics and applied them to how the players and the characters in the game interact with the world around them. You want to shoot someone, you roll 12-sided dice. You want to hack a computer, you roll 12-sided dice. You want to sneak up on somebody and beat them in close combat, Same thing. Okay, so I'm taking the core and I'm applying it to the solution. But the existence of such mechanics as, well, how do I open a locked door? How do I sneak behind an enemy? The need to have those mechanics is part of the peripheral. All I'm doing is then taking the core mechanic and applying it to the solution. So this is what I mean about the peripheral core, is if you take it away, does the game still work? And if the answer is no, then it's peripheral core. And having spoken about Horizon War Zero Dark, I should also say miniatures war games, and this I guess is the reason why I find myself talking about this idea of a peripheral core in game design that other game designers on YouTube haven't talked about, who are more board game, role-play game, digital game focused. The reason I find myself talking about it is because the peripheral core becomes huge in miniatures games. And it's one of those things that often you don't think about in foundational goals, not because you couldn't, but because it's so intuitive that you don't even spend time thinking about it. So it's stuff like, how large is the table going to be? How much terrain do you actually need? What scale of miniatures are you going to use? Now, I talked about some of this back in the foundational goals episode as the kind of thing you could build into foundational goals, but you don't have to. So if you do build it into your foundational goals, it becomes part of your core mechanics. If, however, it's not in your foundational goals, you don't care what scale a game is, it could be played at 6mm or 54mm or 28mm or 72mm, if it doesn't matter, then it's not part of the core. But eventually you're going to need to move on and say, well, it doesn't work if one player turns up with 15mm miniatures and one player turns up with 54mm miniatures. So I've got to start thinking about what scale I'm pitching this game around. I've got my core mechanics, and I could do it in 15mm, 28mm, 54mm. I could do any of that, and it won't change the core. But if I don't nail it down, the game falls apart. So at this point, we need to nail down. Now, in a lot of my games, I explicitly talk about how they are scale neutral. You know, you can play the game in a range of scales, but you do have to acknowledge scale as part of the peripheral core so that you avoid the situation of players trying to play the game with miniatures in completely different scales, which the game would, mechanically the game would work, but it would fall apart because the suspension of disbelief, the investment in events that are taking place on the table for the players, would collapse if one turned up with a miniature this big and one turned up with a miniature this big. You know, and they're both supposed to be humans. Obviously, if one's a mech and it doesn't matter. But if they're both supposed to be regular-sized humans, you know, the game falls apart. Hence, peripheral core. Same with things like table size, same with things like terrain. Infinity the game, really good example of the peripheral core in action, because when they first released Infinity the game back in its first edition and its second edition, there was no real attempt by the designers to engage with that aspect of the peripheral core, which is terrain. They just kind of threw the rules out there and let the realization dawn upon players, particularly in second edition, that the game didn't work without a really dense terrain set compared to most games that were on the market at the time, because they made things like heavy machine guns incredibly powerful. If you were able to stand on one side of the table and just blast an HMG at every opposing miniature, all that would happen was that the two sides would put down HMGs and shoot at each other until one side was dead. And that was a very dull game. Mechanically it worked, but the game fell apart from its concept. Now they realised that once second edition started to pick up, and then when they got into third edition, the designers were now engaged actively with that aspect of the peripheral core. And you found advice in the rulebook saying, you should have a table that looks like this. This much is too much, this much isn't enough, this much is about right. You know, that became part of the game. It was the peripheral core being engaged with. Totally irrelevant to the mechanics of the game, but without that, the game fell apart. And you see this throughout miniatures gaming. And a lot of people who come first to miniatures game design as aspiring designers who've played games for a long time and want to start writing their own games, or who are starting to deconstruct the games that they're playing, often overlook the peripheral core because so much is assumed. And particularly if your exposure to war games has been the classic big battle, big green mat, a few hills and trees, and big groups of troops that move around, you tend to come to the game with assumptions that that's what a war game looks like. And so it's easy to write a game and never engage with that part of the peripheral core that thinks, well, hang on, what shape should a regiment be? Hang on, how should they maneuver around different types of terrain? How does the game change if we fight it in an urban terrain or a rural terrain? How does it change if we fight it on a 3-foot by 2-foot table instead of an 8-foot by 4-foot table? All of those questions are part of the peripheral core, which is why, with a miniatures war game that's so flexible and leaves so much of the active implementation of the game to the players, that it's easy for designers in this industry to overlook aspects of the peripheral core. And if there is anything that I have learned, it is that you will always overlook an aspect of the peripheral core. When I wrote Horizon Wars, and I was very new to war games design, I kind of thought that I could tell people how to play a game. By the time I wrote Zero Dark, I had learned that you can't. All you can do is give them some tools and then stand back and observe how they play the game and then try to adapt your game to what they do. Now, sometimes that's great, sometimes it doesn't work. Good example, again, if you don't mind me calling on Infinity the game again, that they noticed that people were beginning to play the game more and more in a competitive environment. The original second edition of the game had no scenarios, no missions. Everything was left up to the players to invent their own missions. But the people who were engaging with the game didn't want that. They wanted to be given a level playing field from which they could pick missions to play against each other. And they wanted a sense that there was a global playing field in which to participate. And early player-created attempts, such as the famous YAMS, Yet Another Mission System, were adopted enthusiastically until Corvus Belli engaged with the problem and created the Infinity Tournament system that provided to the community a fixed set of missions within which they were supposed to play and test one another. Now, whether that turned out to have been a good thing or a bad thing is another question. There are narrative missions. There were narrative missions early in the process, which was in Corvus Belli trying to sort of push back against that that tournament-focused scene. It had limited success. Now, whether 4th edition is going to turn that around, I don't know. But that was a good example of Infinity, Corvus Belli, ignoring an aspect of the peripheral core, which is missions, setting. What's the level playing field within which I am playing? Now, I put out missions for Horizon War Zero Dark when I began, and I've put out more since, but I am constantly listening to the people who play, trying to understand how is it that they play? What kind of table do they use? What kind of experiences do they actually want from their games, both in a solo and a co-op scenario? And they seem to be very different expectations. But all of that falls into the realms of the peripheral core. Okay, I hope I have done this subject justice. Before I finish, I think it's important, first of all, to say that your understanding of what is the peripheral core may vary from mine. What actually falls into it is a huge breadth of stuff, because if you've built stuff into your foundational goals and it's been in your mind as you've developed your core mechanics, you may find that everything that I've said should fall into the peripheral core, actually, you consider to be part of your core mechanics, and that is fine. Next episode, I'm going to be talking about the bells and whistles. And again, you may think some of the things I've described as being the peripheral core actually belong as bells and whistles. They're not essential to the game. They're completely superfluous. You can play the game quite happily without them. Opinions may differ. Your mileage may vary. That is completely fine. The only thing I would ask you to take away from this episode is to remember that there is a peripheral core. Whether you and I share the same opinion of what falls into it doesn't matter. If you're designing your game or you're deconstructing a game that you're playing, understanding that there is this category of stuff that doesn't affect the core rules, that is completely independent of it, but without which the game will fall apart, then I have done my job here. And the last thing I should say before I go is that Precinct Omega has released a new game. Blood and a Black Flag is a loosely piratical themed swashbuckling skirmish game which you can get at Wargame Vault. Right there. I'd really appreciate it if you checked it out. It's only £5, and obviously you get a chance to see everything that I've said in these videos in practice if you have a look at my games. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time. If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting Precinct Omega via Patreon for behind-the-scenes, early access and exclusive extra videos and vlogs, or help keep the show on the road and get great new games from Precinct Omega at Wargame Vault.